Welcome, everyone. We'll get going right away here, being prompt on time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the lead producer of Generator. My name is Christina Lemieux, she, her. And we're so pleased to partner with Artist Legal Advice Services in Ontario to offer this webinar and discussion on not-for-profit law and governance in the creative industries. The Generator offices are located in Dagarundu, where the trees meet the water. And we acknowledge the original caretakers include Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and other nations acknowledged and unacknowledged, recorded and unrecorded. We recognize our ongoing stewardship and meaningful relationships with local Indigenous artists and community as we listen and learn to their stories. And today we're here to talk about protocols in a very different sense than that, as we look deep into what the legal requirements are for our not-for-profit board of directors structure. This has been a big question for most of my career, but especially in the last year, as we're looking to really investigate what we can be doing different to build the communities we want to be in. We're really honored to have this group of people with us today to help us imagine and dream while understanding what our legal compliance requirements are. A couple housekeeping things. In a moment, I will go off camera and I will be in the background running Generator captions in context, where if anyone uses an acronym or a link is mentioned, I will be popping that into the chat. Kat will be moderating, and I'll turn over to her in 1 second. And just another note to say that we are recording this webinar. The presentation portions of it will be made available to the public, and we will also do our best to compile the more discussion pieces through our blog, which you can check out, where we're sharing lots of things about what to say. I forgot one thing, which is that if you are not in the lands of Dagarundu and want to share where you are, please feel free to add that to the chat, as I will now, so we get a sense of where everyone is joining us from. Before I turn over to Kat, or maybe Kat will do it, Annie, you had a poll that we wanted to open with, but maybe we should let that go for a bit before, as people are sort of coming in and settling in. We'll let Kat do the introductions and then share the poll then. All right, Kat, I turn it over to you, and thank you so much for working with us.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you to Christina and Generator TO for hosting this session. We're very excited for it. To echo what Christina said, we're confident that we'll provide you with both a practical, legal, as well as operational discussion around governance issues. I'll start with a few introductions. I'll do some very high-level housekeeping notes as well, just about how today's talk will work, and then I'll hand it over to our esteemed panelists. So to begin, my name is Kat Lovrics, and I am an intellectual property lawyer and trademark agent. I'm a partner at a law firm called Marks & Clark. We're an international firm that specializes in all areas of IP. In my private practice, I work with a wide range of clients in arts and culture, with an obvious focus on intellectual property as well as digital issues. My specialty is copyright, trademark, personality, and publicity rights. I do not practice not-for-profit or charities law, so I'm very excited to hear from Terry as well as Jane today on their perspectives here. Today, I'm here in my capacity as a board member of ALAS. ALAS is the Artist Legal Advice Services. We coordinate a legal clinic that provides summary legal advice for free to the creative community in Ontario. We've been serving the community for over 30 years. Our goal is to empower the creative community by providing summary legal advice, information, and education. Please check out our website at alasontario.ca and spread the word. Now, I'll briefly introduce our panelists. We have very esteemed panelists here with us today, each of whose reputation precedes them, and I'm thrilled to have the honor of introducing them and moderating this session. First, we have Terence Carter, or Terry Carter, who's managing partners of Carter's, which is one of the leading, if not the leading, charity and not-for-profit law firm in Canada. Mr. Carter practices exclusively in the area of charity and not-for-profit law and is counsel to Faskin on charitable matters. He's co-authored and edited various legal publications in the area of charity and not-for-profit law, which are definitely useful resources. His publications include Corporate and Practice Manual for Charitable and Not-for-Profit Corporations, charities legislation and commentary, as well as branding and copyright for charities and not-for-profit organizations or nonprofit organizations. Terry is recognized as a leading expert by Lexpert, the best lawyers in Canada, and Chambers and Partners. He's on the CRA Advisory Committee on the charitable sector and is past chair of the Canadian Bar Association and Ontario Bar Association's charities and not-for-profit law sections. We also have with us today Jane Marsland. Jane has been an articulate advocate for the arts for many years, and she's served on a wide range of boards, advisory groups, and committees. She's managed arts organizations since 1970. Since 1999, Jane's been working as a freelance arts consultant and has worked with more than 100 arts organizations. She was co-founder and director of Arts for Change, a 3-year program designed to create positive change for and by arts professionals in Toronto. She's also co-founder and director of the Creative Trust, Working Capital for the Artists, or for the Arts rather. Jane has worked on countless initiatives. For example, recently Jane worked with the Toronto Alliance for Performing Arts and Arts Action Research on a 2-year community initiative. She's also worked on Theaters Leading Change Toronto, involving 18 small and mid-sized theater and dance organizations. Jane's contributions have been celebrated, and she's been the recipient of various awards and accolades over the course of her career. Today, we were supposed to have with us as well Carol Hansel, who unfortunately was not able to join us today due to a family medical emergency. I do thank Carol for all the time that she put in helping us shape this talk. Carol is one of Canada's preeminent experts when it comes to governance issues at a corporate level, including for not-for-profit and charities. And we're sad not to have her with us today, but she certainly is a wonderful resource and did help shape today's discussion. Before I hand it over to Terry, I'll give you a very brief overview of what we plan on discussing today. First, Terry will begin today's discussion by giving a lay of the land of sort of the legal landscape when it comes to not-for-profit and charities law. He'll also speak to legal issues relating to governance squarely. We'll then open it up to a brief Q&A specific to sort of the legal side and Terry's talk. And Terry will have to leave us for about 25 minutes from 1:40 to about 2:05, and he'll join us then for Q&A at the end. After Terry's initial talk, I'll turn it over to Jane Marsland, who will walk us through operational governance issues. She will also have a quick presentation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A specific to her. When Terry joins us, we'll have a general question and answer session. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. That is where we invite you to put your questions and answers, and we'll do our best to get to all questions, but appreciating the number of people on this line, it may not be possible to do that, but we will do our best. I will now, without any further ado, or actually I will, with a bit of delay, we'll do a quick poll. I'll pass it over to Annie. This will help our panelists get a sense of those of you that are in the audience, so that we can tailor our answers. In front of you, you should have a poll that appeared that asks in what capacity you're joining today, whether or not you work for a charity, a not-for-profit organization, if you're an individual interested in the topic, if you're interested in incorporating but have not yet done so, or if you're a board member. You can answer as many of those as you wish, and it'll just give us a quick sense of who's with us today. I'll give everyone a moment to reply.
Yeah, we'll just give it maybe a few more seconds. Everyone replied very promptly, which is great. Just going to give it 10 more seconds, then we'll end the poll.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy. All right, so most of the people that are with us today, 58% work at a non-profit organization. 22% work at a charity. There's about 30% of you that are just not just individuals, that are individuals interested in the topic. A few of you are interested in incorporating but have not yet done so, and about 33% of you are board members. So we have a wonderful mix in the audience. I will now pass it over to Terry to begin his presentation. Terry, let us know if you have any trouble screen sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone today and to be on the panel with Jane. This is a great opportunity and happy to participate. My apologies, I will be away for about 20 minutes. I participate on the American Bar Association. They're meeting this afternoon and I need to participate in a meeting with them, but we'll be back shortly after 2 o'clock. So what I've got up on the screen are PowerPoints. Hopefully everyone can see it. Catherine, is that showing up? Good. Okay, that's great. So what I'm going to do is sort of set the landscape, as Catherine said, for the next 20 minutes or so, and then I'll take questions for about 10 minutes. I want to talk about the legal context for being a director or officer of a charity or not-for-profit corporation, dealing, of course, in the arts community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of corporations, what it means to be a director or officer, what are some of the duties, and then most importantly, I want to talk about some due diligence steps that can be taken to manage those duties and responsibilities. Jane is going to then, during her presentation, talk from the perspective of the consultant to ensure that the interpretation of how to move from the legal into the practical is taken into account. And hopefully, Jane and I can do this from both sides of the coin to give you some practical takeaways to help you today. If you're looking for more information on legal issues, we do have a website of carters.ca or charitylaw.ca that has a number of free resources that you can go to get some more information as we go through. Well, first of all, when we're talking about being a director and officer and some of the duties associated with it, we have to understand what it is that a director or officer is in charge of. So if you're going to have an artistic community, you're either going to be an unincorporated association of number of people getting together with a common purpose, and that's perfectly fine, and it's perfectly legal to do that. You can have a constitution and write it up any way that you wish. And you can also have a trust whereby individuals hold property in trust for a particular purpose. But the vast majority of organizations are set up as corporations, and corporations are separate legal entities, and they come in 3 different varieties. And I thought what I would do is just kind of highlight the 3 types of corporations, because that's going to impact what you do as directors and officers, and also will impact the governance of those organizations and what you can do from a practical and a legal perspective. So the first type of corporation, just as a bit of background, is when you've got a for-profit corporation that's referred to as a share capital corporation, because you can see down at the bottom, you've got shareholders, they've got a proprietary interest, they own the corporation, they elect the directors appoint the officers, and they're the employees, or could be employees, who carry out the work of the corporation and intersect with the public. Most of you are not going to be involved with a for-profit corporation, although some of you could be if your artistic endeavors involve some aspect of a for-profit enterprise. The second type of corporation is a not-for-profit corporation, and here it's quite different. Instead of having shareholders down at the bottom having an ownership interest, instead what you have are members, and members, they don't own anything, but they have a great deal of interest in what the corporation does. Corporation has to be set up for any purpose other than to make a dollar. And a not-for-profit organization is exempt from tax, and most of you are not-for-profit organizations. Technically, under the Income Tax Act, it's referred to as a non-profit organization, sometimes used interchangeably with not-for-profit, but technically, if you're not a charity and you're a not-for-profit corporation, then for tax purposes, you'll be exempt from tax as a nonprofit organization. And here, no one owns it, but the members have that responsibility to keep the corporation headed in the right direction. The third type of corporation is also a not-for-profit corporation. It's got members down at the bottom as opposed to shareholders, and they elect directors and they appoint officers, and here you can have employees, plus you can have volunteers because folks may want to get involved as volunteers. But the difference is that the purpose of the organization is focused on achieving what's referred to as a charitable purpose that's got a public benefit associated with it. So some of the artistic organizations that are on the webinar today are organized as charities because you're doing something of public benefit. Some of you who are nonprofit organizations might very well qualify to be a charity as well. So that's something that you can always go back and take a look at. But it is more onerous being a charity without question, because there are tax benefits associated with it. You can issue charitable donation receipts and receive gifts from other charities and foundations. So those are the three types of corporations, and most of you are going to be either the previous corporation, not-for-profit corporation, but not a charity, or you're a not-for-profit corporation, but you have a purpose of being a charity as your charitable purpose. Well, let's take a look at what it means then to be a director or officer of a not-for-profit corporation, which I refer to as an NFP. NFP can be either a charity or not. And so again, it encompasses just about everyone on this call today. A director is basically the individual or individuals that take on the role of making decisions for the corporation. They're the directing minds of the corporation. Doesn't make a difference what you call a director. You can call the person a trustee or a governor or board member. It's not so much what they're called, it's what the board does. And the board then has the authority to govern. And as I'm sure Jane will talk about in more detail, governance is really the process of decision-making involved with an organization. So at the end of the day, the board are the ones that are responsible for the decision-making. But of course, you can't do that in isolation. The board has to work in conjunction with its officers and with senior management. It needs to be a partnership that takes place. So legally, what are officers? Well, they're the individuals who carry out the decisions by the board of directors. They carry out the day-to-day functions that take place. Some of you will be familiar with these terms: president and vice presidents, CEO, executive director, and so forth. The directors have a fiduciary obligation to make sure that they're focused on achieving the purpose of the organization, artistic organization. It's possible that a director could be an officer, so it could be one and the same, or you could have an individual like a CEO or an executive director who's not on the board of directors. It's possible to have them separated. You do want to make sure that if an officer is not on the board, that they don't take on the responsibility and liability of being a de facto director. You want to leave the decision-making ultimately up to the board. But of course, good governance involves a partnership approach between senior management and the board of directors working together as a team. Well, a couple of comments about what are the duties at both common law and statutory duties. Well, at the end of the day, the buck does stop at the board of directors. They're legally in charge of managing or supervising the management of the affairs of the corporation. And of course, a good board, if it has senior management, it's going to work in conjunction with the senior management to ensure that the purposes are carried out. How do directors fulfill what they have to do? I like to put it in simple terms. They need to keep focus on what the purposes of the corporation are. And if you're incorporated and you haven't looked to see what your purposes are or the objects, do that. Very important, because legally that's your responsibility to achieve or to focus on achieving those purposes. Secondly, of course, you need to remain financially viable. That's always a good objective to have. That's a crowd pleaser for sure. And then you have to have oversight over the operations of the corporation, and do that in conjunction with your management. And then finally, the board needs to have oversight over employees as well as volunteers. Volunteers are such an important component to what not-for-profits and charities do. Sometimes they're kind of forgotten. I look at them as being sort of the equivalent of unpaid employees. Your responsibilities for them, your responsibilities for what your volunteers do. So you want to make sure your board is aware of that. Just briefly, when it comes to standard of care and duty of care, what this means is there are statutes. I've listed them here. They're not that exciting, but the statutes, if you're incorporated, that will apply, will generally have an objective standard of care. That means you look at what the average reasonable person would do. That's what you're expected to do. You're not expected to be perfect. You're expected to fulfill an objective standard of care. And the duty of care that you have reflects the care and the diligence that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in similar circumstances. So I think that is helpful, because counsel of perfection is not what you're expected to do. We also have what's referred to as the business judgment rule. And if your board has made a decision, even if it wasn't the best decision, under the circumstances, the courts generally say, well, the board, if they did their due diligence, thought it through, made a decision, generally the courts aren't going to come back and say, well, you did it wrong. They look at what is appropriate as a business judgment rule under the circumstances. This slide just gives you an idea of what's referred to as what are called common law fiduciary duties. And this applies whether you're a not-for-profit that's not a charity, or even if you're a charity. The basic common law fiduciary duties means you always put the best interests of the corporation ahead of your own. When you come to a board meeting, you're thinking of what's best for the corporation. And so that means that if you have interest in other corporations or other events, you need to put those to the side and think through only of what's best for the corporation. Duty of diligence means, well, you've got to do your homework. You got to read your agenda. You got to check your minutes. And sometimes that's hard to do with boards that are particularly big. One client I've had, an arts organization, they have a board of 45 people, because it's sort of reflecting, if you're a big giver, then you go on the board of directors. It's tough if you don't plan to actually do the homework that's involved. Maybe it's better to be on more of a fundraising committee than to be on the board of directors. You need to do your due diligence. You need to exercise the power, and at the end of the day, the board has the legal authority to make decisions. Doesn't mean that they act in a way that is a dictator. They need to work in partnership with senior management, but someone at the end of the day has to make the hard decisions, and that's the board of directors. Duty obedience simply means you got to know the law, keep up to date with what the law is, and ensure that you're doing your best to be able to comply with it. Duty of confidence means that you don't have chit chats with your family after a board meeting to talk with them about what took place at a board meeting. You need to keep it confidential within the confines of a board discussion. Duty to avoid conflict of interest means just that. If you see that you've got an interest in a decision, you need to declare it, not participate. And if you happen to be a charity, then you may not be able to stay on the board of directors. And finally, a duty to continue is if you do get into a pickle, you don't want to simply jump ship. You want to make sure that the ship is able to get back to safe harbor. So having all board members resign en masse is not exactly the best example of good governance. If you happen to be involved on the board of a charity, then the fiduciary duties, there are some additional ones that you need to be aware of. Again, we're looking at sort of a public benefit associated with being a charity. It's got tax benefits associated with it. So it's important that the board focuses on achieving the charitable purpose. Take a look at your corporate documents to know what they are. You need to protect your property, and whether that property be hard assets in the bank or, as Catherine's talked about, intellectual property is very important, of course, to the arts community, both the branding and the copyright side. And if you do happen to be fortunate enough to have $1 or $2 to invest, there are requirements concerning investment of funds in Ontario, primarily under the Trustee Act of Ontario. There's an obligation not to have any benefit for directors of charities. So if you want to get a salary or you want to be a consultant for the charity, it's really not possible to be on the board of the charity unless you fit within certain exemptions that have been established under legislation, or you go so far as to get a court order, not something, frankly, you want to do. And then finally, a duty to account. Because you are a charity, then it is sometimes necessary to explain what you've done with the dollars that you have. That can come from either the Public Guardian of Ontario, Trustee of Ontario, or Canada Revenue Agency if you happen to be a registered charity. Now I want to give just a couple of thoughts for you with regards to due diligence in managing the duties that you have and the risk. First one is, it's important to understand what your role is in being on the board. Doing education, similar to what you're doing today, having a good, robust board manual and keeping that up to date, having appropriate governance policies in place, conflict of interest, confidentiality, board conduct, audit committee. Those are all good basic governance policies that can help you whether you're a not-for-profit or you're a registered charity. Also important to have robust operational policies to make sure you're managing the various aspects of what you do. If you're working with donors or individuals, a privacy policy is important. Children, you need to have an abuse policy, interfacing social media, or have a social media policy. What do you put on, what don't you? Investments, harassment, anti-spam, whistleblowing, facility use. Those are all sort of examples. It's not comprehensive, but it gives you an example of the types of operational policies you may want to have, whether you're small or large. These are good things to keep in mind. And if you're a corporation, you can get indemnity. The corporation can provide indemnity, which means that the corporation will reimburse directors, officers, and others for costs that they incur in the event that, a worst case scenario was to happen and there happened to be legal action. So take a look at your bylaws to see if you do have an indemnity bylaw in place. And then finally, in order to manage the duties that you have, it's important to take a look at your insurance. Work with your broker, do a review of your policies, your general liability, and if you're providing some programs for children, you want to look at abuse. If you're providing some professional programs, errors and omissions, directors and officers insurance is always important, data breach and so forth. The reason that I mention this is that everyone who gets involved with a not-for-profit or a charity is not doing it for the money. You're doing it because you have a passion for the purpose. What you don't want to do is expose yourself unnecessarily to liability. And the way to address it, the best way, is to be familiar with your insurance, to be comfortable with it, work with your broker to get the appropriate insurance in place, and then make sure that you have succession of board worked out on a policy. And then the final slide is just to indicate that when you're recruiting individuals, you don't have to have them on the board. They can go on to committees or advisory boards. They don't have exposure to the same types of duties. They're accountable to the board. That's an effective way to include more individuals, but without having the full weight of being on the board. And then finally, to have an effective risk management approach towards your operations, it's good to have a committee in place that can help to deal with it. We have at our website checklists, which we do up each year for charities and nonprofit organizations. Again, it's just a sample of the sorts of things that you may want to give consideration to. So Catherine, those are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share, and hopefully that's been of some help, and be happy to take any questions that there may be.
Thank you, Terry. That was excellent. Hopefully you can hear me again.
I can hear you.
Managed to remember not to, or to turn myself off mute. We've had one question come in, and then I have a series of questions as we wait for others. The question that came in when you were at the beginning outlining the sort of chart of various stakeholders in a particular organization. The question is whether or not it's mandatory to fill all of those tiers. So do you need members? Do you need officers? Do you need directors? Do you need employees? And do you need volunteers?
As a corporation, you must have directors. Basically, you need a minimum of 3. You must have at least 1 member. A member then is responsible to elect the board. So under Canadian corporate law, membership is required. You need to have officers. They're the ones that, again, carry out the function. So all of those are mandatory, okay? Directors, members, officers. Do you have to have employees? No. Do you have to have volunteers? No. It's not a legal requirement, but it tends to reflect sort of reality. Sometimes directors wear many hats. They're the directors. They can also be the members. They can also be the officers. They can also be the volunteers. And a new startup artistic organization, that's likely what you would see.
I have a follow-up, and if anyone else has questions, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, if you click on it, I'm happy to manage questions. You mentioned, Terry, in your talk that there should be a line between directors and officers. How would you recommend approaching that line? Or what rules can you put in place to ensure that, you know, when the director is wearing their director hat, they're acting as a director, and when they're the officer, they're executing those instructions?
Well, if it's the same individual that's doing both, there will be certainly seepage between the two. I think that sort of goes without, you know, that's going to occur. I think what I was trying to get at is where you have an individual who's an officer and not a director. For instance, an executive director. Executive directors are fundamental, and to have that relationship between the executive director and the board through the chair of the board is really the most important relationship that you can have. And it needs to be healthy, and it needs to be a team approach. But what the executive director doesn't want to do is become a director and become subject to all of the duties and the liabilities. So a good executive director will work very hard to do all the legwork and work in partnership with the chair of the board, but then leave it up to the board to say yay or nay. You know, at that point, the executive director would be wise to say, I've done my job. Here are my thoughts. Here are my recommendations. I'll advocate hard for a position, but you, board, will make the determination. Hopefully it's a good one, but if it's a bad one, then the executive director then is is insulated from the responsibility that goes with that. So that, I think, Catherine, was my suggestion, is from, with the hat on as the paid senior management person, unless you relish the idea of being responsible and exposed to liability, it's always helpful to know how far you can go before you take on liability as a de facto director. And again, it's not something that most people in a paid position would want to take on.
Understood. A follow-up question came from the audience about what's the difference between, if there is one other than semantics, what's the difference between a CEO and an executive director?
Yeah, very, very little difference. I think they're more functional. A chief executive officer is sort of the senior management person. Executive director is the senior management person. So some organizations prefer the title of CEO, president and CEO, chair and CEO, they'll kind of combine them together. So there really isn't much of a difference. Name is not the key issue. It's the function which is the key issue. Okay. So senior management individuals can be called by a number of different names. I always get a little confused when they use the word director, right? So executive director, is that suggesting that they're also a director on the board of directors? So CEO helps to make it clear that they're not on the board of directors.
And you've I think the other question that came in, was telepath to you, because it was, what's the difference between officers of the board and officers of the corporation? With the question, the examples given were a chief financial officer and a CEO, but I think to my mind, the executive director question is a good one. So is it the executive function or title that crosses the line?
So you can have different functions within an organization, such as maybe chief information officer, that doesn't constitute a corporate officer as required under the corporate legislation. You need to have, if it's an Ontario corporation, you need a president, you need a secretary, you need a treasurer. You could probably expand that out to have a vice president. You might decide to have a chair. Those are all sort of recognized as being basic corporate officer positions. You could also have operational officer positions like chief information officer, is referred to as officer, but it doesn't mean that they have the same governance function as a corporate officer. They're more dealing with sort of an operational officer position. They wouldn't necessarily be referred to in the general operating bylaw of the corporation. So as organizations sort of expand, sometimes there's a bit of a blurring between, are they officers for operational purposes or are they official officers of the corporation? So it's important when you're drafting your bylaws to get some distinction, some clarity concerning that.
And then a follow-up was, what does ex officio mean, and what is that role? Is it a formal role?
Ex officio, just in a nutshell, means by virtue of office. So if you have a director, and you can do that under the Ontario Corporations Act, a director who becomes a director on an ex officio basis. So if they're, for instance, the hospital foundation, if the CEO of the hospital could be ex officio a director of the hospital foundation, as an example, automatically, so by virtue of office. If you're incorporated federally, you can't do that. You cannot have an ex officio director. They all have to be elected. So it's by virtue of office.
Thank you. And in the minute we have left before you have to go to your CBA meeting, how soon do you have to set up your board, being a minimum of 3 from startup?
Well, again, if you're going to be incorporated, you have to have your directors in place immediately. You can't just set up a corporation without having a board. So we normally suggest that, again, minimum of 3. A board of 5 tends to be a bit better because, you know, that way you've got a little bit of backup in case some folks can't make it out to a meeting. But you need to have your board ready to function right off the bat.
Okay, there are a series of other questions that we'll reserve for when you return. Thank you, Terry, very much. I hope the ABA update goes well. And I will now turn it over to Jane Marsland. Jane, I think Annie is going to pull up your slides. So thank you, Terry.
I am.
And for those of you that submitted questions that weren't replied to, they remain in queue. So thank you very much. And I encourage you to continue submitting questions as Jane begins her talk. Oh, Jane, you're on mute.
Thank you. And thanks for the introduction. Well, as you can see from Terrence's very thorough presentation, it can be very daunting if you haven't incorporated yet, or if you are moving from not-for-profit to charitable. There can be a lot of things to think about. So I think what I would like to do is in this presentation, sort of how do you safely navigate the legal requirements as a not-for-profit arts organization, so particularly if you're small to mid-size. So I won't be talking very much about anything that's institutional. And the other thing I wanted to cover as we go through these slides is that there's a lot of new thinking coming about to understand. There's been a very rapid shift in the understanding of what an organization is. In the past, it was seen as a very hierarchical, kind of a rigid structure that was to have perpetual life. And now we're thinking in terms of, what is called a complex adaptive system. That is, it's based on a living systems and the kind of an ecological perspective where not only is there birth involved and maturity, but there's also death. So it's not as if every organization has to go on forever, unless there's a very specific reason why it should. There's more than one board model, and what are the implications of that to you and your board and the sector? And then I thought I'd really look at improved board processes for small to mid-sized arts organizations, especially recruitment. So Annie, can you get to the next slide? And one of the things that I found in my work, whenever I asked people what governance was, no one really had an answer. It was very hazy in their minds, and often they confuse leadership, management, and governance. So the next slide. So I've tried to come up with a bit of a definition. So it's really the art of steering your organization. I think Terrance talked about it. It was like, it's making choices and decisions, right? Of how what it is, how you move forward, how you really integrate some of those legal requirements. But first and foremost, it requires real clarity about the why of the organization. What is the fundamental purpose? What is the vision, mission, values around that? And how do you achieve it in the healthiest way possible? And moving towards your goals and assuming responsibility for the sustainability of the organization. And the way I do that with organizations I work with is I have them develop what I call an organizational profile, rather than those 1 or 2 sentence, what I call mission statements, which could be anybody. It's an internal document that outlines, the context around why you started the organization, what was the background, and what were some of the the social or artistic or whatever context around why you wanted to develop it. Really laying out the organizational beliefs and values, why the artistic work that you want to produce or create, and the kind of internal culture that you're trying to develop, and a real understanding of that it has to be a healthy artistic process, so that you can align the way the culture and the values that work in the studio or the rehearsal room are the same as those in the administrative area, and are the same as those in the board, so that there's no dysfunction. Because sometimes what happens is, in an arts organization, you have one set of very collaborative process of working in the studio or rehearsal room, and could be a hierarchical, more rigid corporate set of values in either the administrative area or the board. They have to all align, and align from the creative process to be a healthy organization. And so once that, and it has quite a number of other things, but once that profile is developed and is shared amongst everybody, including the board, so that there's a true understanding of and an agreement about how the organization is structured and its purpose and values and culture, that is like a laser that runs through all the decision making from then on. And it is foundational to the governance process. So, and governance is a process. And again, this is a belief of mine, that it's a shared responsibility between the professional staff and the volunteer board. The professional staff cannot just lay all the governance and accountability to the legal requirements to the board only. The governance has to permeate the entire organization and the responsibilities for it. So next slide. One of the things that I have begun to really understand is that there's an emergence of new governance models at new levels and scales, so that the governance model for an entry or an emerging entity is much less structured, and is very kind of emergent and organic, and probably doesn't have many committees or whatever. And in fact, as I'll say further on, it's important to keep like a minimal viable board at the beginning. So when you go back to the legal outline, you must have 3 board members to as part of, I think, right across both the not-for-profit and the charitable. There's the minimum board is 3. Also, again, bringing in that systems perspective so that there's birth, maturity, death, renewal, whatever. It's not just a linear trajectory of growth. It can be, but it's not only that. And over time, there's an increasing focus on the arts organization's relationship into the community. Sometimes in the past, it was very much only about its work, and it was kind of closed to the community. But now that's opening up, and the community can be an important partner. And the interorganizational alliances, networks of relationships, part of some traditional boards are so focused on their own mission that they won't do collaborative work. And so a lot of the collective impact in social work, but also in arts organizations, working together on broader projects, there needs to be an understanding that it's not just about your own mission, but what is your relationship to the sector too? I kind of call that from ego to echo, from an the much more, it's only about my work, to how is my work placed in an ecology in our society. So next slide. Did you want to turn to the next slide, Annie, please?
She's trying. I can see the mouse moving.
Sorry.
Oh, Annie, your audio is a bit choppy. Maybe use the chat.
Is it me frozen or?
No, I think it's Annie that's frozen. I could hear her. She's having internet issues.
Well, you know what? We can catch up, because I can keep going, and we can catch up with the slides, because everybody will get a copy of the slides, I believe, right?
Okay, I think
rather than just, oh, here we are. There we are. So the overview of the current reality is right at the moment, well, it's probably been for the last 40 years, because arts organizations have to raise money, contributed money, either grants and if they're charitable donations, and it's increasingly difficult to raise those contributed funds. There's a historic inequity, so that like organizations that are starting up now are not able to get the level of funding that organizations that were founded 40, 50 years ago. So there's about 4 generations of artists who have really had an enormous struggle to be able to get the kind of resources to develop their organizations and keep them going. And then the fact that we need board members and volunteers to help. At the same time, the professional and personal reality of people whom we select as board members, their lives have become more complex and stressful, and they're becoming more project and task focused. So they might really like what you're doing, but they often, if you ask them to come on the board, they'll say no, but they will be willing to take on a project that's time limited. So those are kind of some of the difficulties around, building a board of directors. And next slide, please.
I think Annie may be having difficulty again.
Okay, should have probably done this slide, so that's okay. Well, the next slide is just our arts organizations are encumbered with theories and myths about what a board.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that audio was. Jane, go ahead. Sorry.
I think she's like as Zoom is wont to do, freezing on us. Anyway, so arts organizations are encumbered with theories and myths about what a board should, would, or could do. So there's no single board model. We can't always use the institutional or corporate lens in examining small arts organizations. When we go out to find board members, we must know what we want from the board member. For years, people would come and ask me to be on their board. And I usually say things like, well, no, I can't, I'm way too busy. And then they would say, oh, well, you don't have to do anything. I mean, that is the worst thing that you could do. It's just, you want to know precisely what you want from the board member so that you can really provide them with a role that they can see what they're getting into. And the professional staff have to assume the authority, accountability, and responsibility for their organization, but they can only do this in collaboration with the board. Then the board is their community partners, and if there's one thing it's entirely about, it is the relationships, the board relationships. So I guess we're still having a problem with
I think we lost Annie.
So the new conceptual building blocks, which is going back to that idea of the paradigm change in, that we're moving from rigid structures to systems. The artistic process is central. If the organizations succeed, it's because of the artistic work or service. So there has to be an understanding that there's a dynamic balance. I think that slide's a previous slide, so I'll just keep on with the one I've got. The leadership, vision, organizational equation, and process is in dynamic balance, and that what that is when you start to like your season, you've got an artistic season or a product or whatever. And because you're an entrepreneurial entity, you have insufficient resources. That's the classic definition of an entrepreneurial system. You've got a great idea product, insufficient resources, and you're willing to take risks in order to deliver the mission. So as an entrepreneurial arts organization, you're an entrepreneurial business to deliver a mission. And the professional leadership must lead. And I'm not talking about the old concept of bossing. The professional leadership has the duty and responsibility to provide the board of directors with an absolute accurate account of the current reality of the organization, the health of it, and any challenges or issues that they foresee coming along, so that the board is working with the information that it needs and can trust, and then the relationship. There's a good relationship and partnership, and the work can really flourish. Well, the organization can thrive. So next slide. So there's 4 slides in a row. These slides, I'm not going to spend any time really going through them. I got them from York University. I did a little workshop with them on some of the latest thinking on board models. And if you go to the next slide, which is the typology of governance configuration, there you can see the different kinds of boards. The horizontal, stable to turbulent, that's the environment that you might be in. And then the simple to complex, the vertical, is whether it, the organization itself is small or very large, or an older or complex structure. And so most arts organizations are in that upper right hand, the entrepreneurial governance configuration. And then if you go to the next slide, they give just a small description of what an entrepreneurial board configuration looks like. And then the next slide is the emergent cellular configuration, which is a little more complex thing from the entrepreneurial board. And that's more for arts organizations that are really trying to pull together other groups and other organizations for climate change or anti-oppression and social justice areas. But because you'll get those slides, you can just go through those. I just wanted you to know that there's lots of different board configurations. So the next slide. So the area I thought it would be good to spend a little bit of time in operations is the one that I feel is the most poorly done in arts organizations, and that's the recruitment process. And so I sort of thought I'd start with, where to start. If you're just thinking of incorporating or you're small, I would stick to what I call the minimum viable board. So legally, it's 3 people. Sometimes I think a minimum viable board is 5 people, just so there's just enough people to gel and to and for a small organization to be able to manage. If you have a huge board, that's a lot of work to really manage all those people so that they feel like they're making a valuable contribution. And in order to find those people in the recruitment process, you really have to get people who have a deep, passionate, personal commitment. That has to be personal too, to the purpose, vision, values, and aesthetic, and have a relationship with a professional leadership. And the reason it has to be personal is that part of the important role of the board is to raise the organization's profile in the community and the public. And they can't do that if they don't come to see the shows, or they don't come to see the work that's exhibited or whatever. If they don't have a personal knowledge of the art form, they can't tell anybody why it's important to them. And that's how they can connect with people. If you're telling a story and it's something that you deeply believe in, there's an energy that you transmit to people to get them to be interested and on side with it. And then you only add more people after deciding whether to have a large board. So in the meantime, I would use, like often suggest people have a resource council, particularly if you have to raise funds. You want to recognize people who have brought, and it's not just money, but people who have brought something of value to the organization. They can sit on the resource council. They don't go to board meetings. They just simply, you have a dinner or a breakfast once a year to thank them, but they're on all your programs and letterhead and whatever. And so sometimes you want, a time constrained task force or some kind of work group to help you with something. At the moment, a lot of people are really trying to diversify their boards, and you might want to bring some people from the areas of the community that you're trying to reach out to be on a diversity task force or whatever, to bring you some perspective and knowledge about how to do that. So the next slide. So the next area that you want to, when you're recruiting, and even usually even at any point, because most boards members don't have an actual role. So you need to sit down and determine the board roles. And I'm not talking about those director positions. I'm talking about, what do you want the board to do? And so what are the 3 or 4 most critical challenges facing your organization? And then use a casting metaphor, because I always use like metaphors. I mean, in the old organizational development, the strategic plans, the metaphors always came from war, because that's where the terminology of strategic came from. So I try to keep everything to an artistic metaphor, and casting is a really good process to follow to find board members. So you want to gain the clarity about the roles, and they're like little three line descriptions of, what do you want the potential board members to undertake. One of the things you also want to do is to help clarify the unique artistic process and the culture of the organization when you're going out to meet with people, because that is an important part of the process, because board members need to know what that is, so they don't come into a place where there's an unhealthy artistic process. You need to also lay out the expectations. Often that's hidden from the board, prospective board members, like fundraising, actually doing things. You want to have, I call this a rigorous audition process, which is the cultivation, going out and really talking to people about the organization, and putting together a really good package of information so that people can make an informed decision. And then, where do you look for new board members? Your core audience should be the key, whatever your organization is. Who cares about it? Who knows about it? So rather than going out and finding people who are completely strangers to the organization, you want people who have already could have made a contribution, have come to bought tickets if it's performing arts, attended shows, attended exhibitions, so that there's a level of knowledge and interest in the organization. So next role, how am I doing for time?
Yeah, Jane, actually, I'm thinking if you don't mind, maybe I can jump in. There's a bunch of questions that have rolled in, and I have a number. Do Do you think we can transition to the Q&A at this point, or are there any specific topics you wanted to cover?
What was I going to? The key things, I'll just look at well, the board roles, people can go through that. Oh, there was one thing, ensuring an effective board, the fourth priority rule in selecting board members. Each person has their personal responsibilities, their family and their, things that they want to do for themselves, their professional responsibilities around their work and jobs and career. They can have one other company or an avocation or hobby or some people have a religious affiliation. But if your organization is not at least the fourth priority in the prospective board member, they won't have any time to do anything for you. So you should, in that process of finding, and cultivating people, try to figure out, because sometimes you run into people and they've got 11, they're on 11 other boards. How can they even begin to, have time to do anything? And I guess the other thing that I think is key is to rethink the board meetings, that instead of just endless reports, is to have a strategic and topic specific agenda. So it's to discuss significant issues affecting the life of the organization. And only have all reports go in writing. I think that I did have a little bit on diversity and inclusion, but I think is clear what I've written there. Okay.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Jane. That was
Sorry,
excellent.
it was a little longer than I thought it would be.
No, that was fantastic and interesting. And I think the board recruitment and structuring your board and being thoughtful about people's roles is very important. In the chat, everyone, there is a link to Jane's slides, and I think Christina will send everyone, or Generator Tio will send all attendees a follow-up in closing the slides, so everyone certainly has them. We've had a number of questions that come in, and before we dive into the questions, I'll invite Terry back if he's still with us. Thanks, Terry.
Oh, good.
And I was thinking that a good place to start, which was sort of thematically, I think, underlying both of your talks, as well as an issue that we discussed, is sort of the concept of clarity of purpose. So Terry, you mentioned in your talk that ultimately the objects of a particular entity should dictate. And I know Jane, in your talk, sort of both focusing on the purpose of an organization from a recruitment perspective, as well as just generally what everyone's roles and responsibilities should be. So if you could both, and maybe I'll start with Jane, if you could just speak to how do you achieve clarity of purpose? How do you keep founders and boards and management and volunteers all on the same page?
Primarily through the development of the organizational profile, which is a constant work in progress, right? And because what it is a document to get agreement and commitment from everybody within the organization, and it's so much of the, like the branding and those exercises, it's squished down into this, I go around to, I work with theaters a lot, and they almost always, you say, what is your purpose? Oh, it's create Canadian plays. Well, usually excellent Canadian plays. I go, yes, but how does that distinguish you from anybody else? It's got to be much, and not enough on the principles and the values and beliefs of the organization, because that's what really attracts people, right? They come to the values. I remember when I was working with a dance company, and a contemporary dance company, which and a very challenging choreographer. And I kept thinking I had to describe, you know, the dance so that get people to it. And then finally, we sent out a huge email to a lot of people, and it was really about the values and beliefs in the work. And all of a sudden everybody said, oh, I believe the same things you do. So if you come to my community, I'll come see your company. And that was when I realized that it's those things that are the attractors. And
well, Jane, there's been requests for a template for an organizational profile. So if there is one to share, I think that the audience would very much appreciate having some guide.
I'll send it to Christina. It's a long document. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it in the end. Yeah, excellent. I'll send it to Christina.
And then Terry, legally, the organization's objects. How do you identify them? Where do they live? And can you change them?
So objects, purposes, mandate, mission, those are all different terminologies which are used. From a legal standpoint, it's important to look at your corporate documents to see what it says. If you're an Ontario corporation, it's referred to as your corporate objects. You'll find it in your letters patent by which you were set up, or if you've amended it, it'll be under your supplementary letters patent. If you're a federal corporation, you'll look for purposes, and that will be contained in your articles of continuance or articles of incorporation. So whether it's purpose or objects, what you're looking at, whether you're a not-for-profit corporation or a charitable corporation, what is the legal authority that you have to operate? And as a result, what are the limitations on what it is that you can do? Keep in mind, a company is a separate person. So what you're looking for is to understand the DNA of the corporation that you're directors and officers of. And Jane's talked about a very good process to understand what your thinking is concerning your purpose. From a legal standpoint, when you do have clarity on what your purpose or objects are, then you want to make sure that it is consistent with what legally is stated in those documents that I mentioned. Simply putting them into a separate policy or even into your bylaw is not sufficient. Lots of organizations will change their focus, their mission, their mandate, their objects, purpose, whatever, but they won't do it in the correct legal document. So you do need to work with legal counsel to make the change. How do you do it? Normally, it's a process of crafting carefully the wording, then it's approved by the board, then it's approved by the membership of the corporation, and then it will go into the correct corporate authority, provincial level or the federal level. And if you happen to be a charity, then you'll need to get your change of purpose or objects approved by Canada Revenue Agency. So there's a formal process to the informal discussion which needs to take place. So nice dovetailing between what Jane has talked about, which is a key aspect. Check it out, figure out what you want, and then you need to convert that into legal wording. If you're a charity, it's very important to get that wording correctly, because your friends at Canada Revenue Agency will look very closely at what you say. It has to meet the definition of what a charity is. Even if you're not a charity, the wording of the objects are very important. Right now, I'm in the process later today of finalizing a legal opinion for a non-charity organization which has literally tens of millions of dollars in assets, which is in some debate concerning the interpretation of their corporate objects. So it can happen that there are disagreements about what you can do with your assets. And so the takeaway is very simple. Do what Jane talked about. By all means, work it through, figure out what you want. and then work with your legal counsel to make sure that the description you come up with then gets reflected in the correct corporate documents and done in the correct process.
Thank you. I'll ask a question, and then I'll turn to one from the audience or two from the audience that are quite important. The question that I'll ask, that I think was touched on by both of you as well, is how should a board and sort of the management team or the executive director, how should they work together? So tips and recommendations. I think ultimately that's sort of the cornerstone of this. You set up your board, you have your volunteers or your operators or the one executive director of an organization. What are the rules for how those two teams should work together? What are the requirements and what are the recommendations? Terry, why don't you start with this one then?
Okay, I'll give you a couple of thoughts to work with. There is potential for disagreement among senior management and the board. And I've talked about the need for a good partnership relationship. How do you do that? How do you effectively do that? Because sometimes personalities, egos can get in the way. And so I go back to sort of a focus on the purpose of the organization as opposed to person, power, or politics. Always keep focused on what you're there to do to achieve the purpose. That can help you in your relationships with, if you're chair of the board, with your senior management or senior management working with the chair. What can best achieve the purpose of the organization? You have to kind of put sometimes some of the ego of the personalities to the side. You have to make sure that you're not overplaying power, because the board does have power, but too much power on senior management doesn't sit well with senior management. And at the same time, senior management need to understand who gets to be sued. It's always the board. You know, at the end of the day, the buck stops with the board. So there needs to be a healthy respect. And then you want to make sure that there's not politics which is taking place. Good communication, working together as a team. And sometimes you even have a profit factor. That's the fifth P in the process. You want to make sure that there's not a focus on trying to make a dollar at the expense of the purpose. So that's a suggestion, is keep focused on the purpose, not on the personality, not on power, not on politics, and not on profit.
Jane?
Just to take it from a different perspective, one of the things that I've always found is that well, it's always about a relationship. I think that Terrance is talking about that a bit, but that a really good working relationship between the professional leadership and the chair too is really critical, because the chair is responsible for the board's internal relationships, and it's sort of like a kind of a way of keeping, like the senior leadership keeps the staff informed and a good, well, hopefully a very good working relationships, and so that pivotal relationship allows the two aspects of the staff and the board to really function at their peak. I think it's been my experience.
I'll turn to a question from those attending related to conflict of interest. So how do you suss out, and Terry, I'll ask you this question first. How do you suss out what is a potential conflict of interest when there is a conflict of interest, and how do you manage that?
There are two layers. One is what the corporate statutes provide for, what the common law provides for. And then the second layer is how do you deal with it from an operational standpoint? Corporate legislation requires that if there is a pecuniary, a monetary conflict that comes up between the director and his or her duties to the corporation, then the director has to declare it and not participate in the discussion. If the organization happens to be a charity, extra obligation on top of that, you have to declare it, not participate. But if the charity goes ahead and maybe wants to hire your spouse as an employee, then the director would have to resign from the board or otherwise fit within some fairly narrow confines of regulations or get a court order. From an operational standpoint, trying to define what a conflict is. You look at it at a pecuniary level, i.e. monetary. You look at it from a standpoint of relationships, i.e. family, business associates. You can look at it from the standpoint of other organizations. You happen to be a member of the board of a hospital, but you're on the board of the foundation. There's no monetary conflict of interest, but there's a conflict dealing with fiduciary duties. So a good conflict of interest policy will help to identify the directors to see when a conflict comes up, and then what's the process in order to try to manage that conflict in a way that's transparent and keeps focused on what's in the best interest of the corporation.
Jean, do you have anything to, or would you like to round that out?
Oh, no, I think that was very clear.
Excellent. We have another question, I think, that many organizations are currently grappling with that relates to diversity and inclusion. Generally, any recommendations for sort of an organization's approach to diversity and inclusion, be it at the board level, be it at the volunteer level, be it at sort of the member community level. Jane, do you want to start for that one?
Yeah, I guess, first of all, almost all arts organizations, it's starting to change, but the ones that have been around for a while are mostly culturally specific, right? And like most of the older ones have really all been focused on Eurocentric art forms. Just now, when you look at the emerging groups coming up, that there's tremendous diversity there. So one of the things that I worry about is now all of a sudden there are a lot of new leaders who have just been hired who are from diverse communities, but they've been put into positions in an organization that has not done the full diversity thing, so there's still basically a white organization. And I feel unless there's a lot of work done to ensure that the senior leader who's now from a different cultural background has the opportunity to make some change and broaden out the kind of cultural offering. It's like a bit of a recipe for disaster, and I don't think there's been enough work to ensure that kind of, that process will be healthy. So I'm not sure how to address that in a legal perspective, except for the importance of really developing inclusion, to make sure that it's not just to diversify, but it's to have the inclusion in part of the process at the fore, so that there's a change that happens. That makes sense. Sorry.
Terry?
Just to add to that, sometimes folks may not have a lot of background as they come on to the boards and leadership, but that can be addressed quite easily by having good training, good board resource materials, so that individuals that are coming into leadership roles for the first time should feel empowered, should feel welcome, should be well equipped to be able to participate and make decisions. So that's a way of making, I think James brings up a good point. Just to have diversity and inclusion without equipping will not fully enable the objective that you would want to have.
As we are now at 2:30, I will thank both of you tremendously on behalf of our audience for an excellent and thought-provoking talk. I think, Terry, your covering of the legal landscape was right on point as always and grounded, and Jane, from an operational and practical perspective, I think that the complement resulted in a very practical discussion, and I trust our audience will agree. I'll turn it over to Christina for any final words, but on behalf of Alas, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for being with us today, and to Alas for partnering with us on this chat. Like I said, I'm happy to stay for like another 15 minutes and just give my lived experience advice on some of those questions that have shown up there that we didn't get a chance to answer, but our guests' time is very valuable, and sure there's many other meetings to run too. So thank you so much for being here, and please do keep in touch with the generator and watch what we're doing and sharing on the blog. Artist Producer Resource does have some resources, not a ton, but some related to nonprofit and charitable management, but it is a thing we talk a lot about. So we're happy to continue the conversation with you. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll give a moment for folks who want to leave, and I'll stick around and see who else wants to keep chatting.
Wonderful.
I can stick around for a little bit.
Great, thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great. Kat, you can stay for a bit too?
Yeah, I have a few minutes.
You maybe have the best sense of where things were answered.
Yeah, so if it's okay, I'll do the Q&A and we can volley between the two of you. I think one of the questions that there was a few questions actually related to both onboarding orientation for board members, as well as succession planning and executive transition. And I think succession planning from a board perspective is also important. Perhaps we could start there. So how do we onboard? So we've recruited, we followed Jane's advice. We've made sure that the people that we're recruiting understand what their mandate is and what they're supposed to do, understand the vision of the organization, they're vested, they're involved, they're there. What do we do to bring them on board?
Maybe I'll talk, James, to give you a bit of a break. Are you ready to go?
Oh, you go ahead, and then I'll add. You go ahead.
I mean, I think it's really important to understand that working with the board is essentially volunteer management. And they're a team just like your team in the rehearsal hall. And so I think where we fall down in the arts so frequently when we're working with our board is that we treat them differently than we would treat a cast of people that we were bringing into our rehearsal hall. So when you've done Jane's amazing work of going through your organizational profile, which Generator did, and the results of that are our culture document, which you can read online. The question is, how do you bring that into your immediate orientation of that group? If you start to think that there's a way to bring your board on that's different than the way you build culture in your organization, that's when you get these fractured organizations with a board and staff team or board and artists who don't understand what's happening. So how do you work with your artists? And I would say find a way to do that with the board that is similar, understanding that the output of what they're creating is different than maybe what a show you're putting on would be.
Oh, I'm so glad you framed it that way, because that perfectly illustrates my theory that, you know, the thread that aligns the board and the staff is the creative process. So using that creative process it is like the way it really works best, you know. So, you know, treating the board the same as you would treat, you know, bringing on a new cast or whatever, you know how to do that. So you just do the same thing, but then they also begin to truly understand that the unique artistic or creative process of the organization they're on the board of.
Excellent. And then succession planning. So the flip side of that coin, not just onboarding, but how do how do you plan for departures and succession? Let's start with the board level. Would you recommend setting specific terms? And how do you deal with reappointment? And then we can turn to the sort of professional side.
Well, if I can answer that, if the board is functioning very well, it's not really a need for terms, but people like to have terms because the one thing that I find, and I the same, I've been on lots of boards myself, when it's working with volunteers, people find it very difficult to have those difficult conversations with people who aren't pulling their weight, right? It's just so hard. So there should be an annual review process. So in that, I think the chair's role is pivotal to, first of all, determine, like at the beginning of any fiscal year, what each board member's contribution, like not just a financial contribution, but the contribution to the work of the board is. So they develop a little annual plan of certain things that they're going to do. And then there's a process of board evaluation, individually board evaluations. And if there's a complete failure in that, those people should be asked to leave so you can bring in new people. Because otherwise, if only a few people on the board are doing all the work and there's a lot of people doing nothing, it affects the board behavior in a negative way. And as far as the succession, I think the succession of the board chair is the most difficult these days because no one wants to be the board chair. So one of the things that I found useful is to get them to split the roles. So you have a chair and a president. This is more for a board of, not a huge board, but not a little 3-member board. But and they're 2 separate roles. The chair's role is to work with the board and make sure that the board is effective and does what it needs to do and has what it needs to do the work. And the president is an external role of representing the organization at various functions, and they don't succeed each other. They're separate roles and different personalities.
I think that was right on point. I think there was a follow-up question related to who should choose who is on the board. So the person that submitted this said that they know the technical legal answer to this question, but in practice, should management get involved in this exercise?
Well, if you're asking me, yes, absolutely. Because if it's got it again, it's got to be a relationship. You can't have 2 solitudes in one organization. So I can tell you, I'll tell you a funny little story about a board I went out to work with. I won't say where, wasn't in Ontario, and the professional staff. There's an old saying, the professionals get the board they deserve, because if they don't do the work to ensure that they've got a board that is really effective for their organization, basically it's their fault. So I went out to this board and it was all men, and every single one of them had come on the board because one person invited them on who was a board member. And none of them ever went to see anything about the show. They were just completely divorced from the organization, and they, they just had their meetings, and then the staff had their meetings, and they were in a dire situation. So they I wouldn't recommend everybody to do this, but I said to them, oh, so you become a self-replicating system. And they said, oh, what's that? And I said, oh, out here you call it mad cow disease. Because it is the death of the organization. There has to be a relationship with the staff and the board in the work of the nominating committee. If there's no professional leadership, they don't even have to have a vote. They just have to influence. But anyway.
No, I think it's there's something to be said for a larger pool. One whole area of discussion that we spent a bit of time, or quite a bit of time on actually in preparing for this, that we haven't really touched on, but I will close with, because I think we've covered the main set of questions, aside from whether or not board insurance is a mandatory, and like the legal answer to that is it's not. The practical answer to that is if you can offer it to board members, depending on the nature of your organization, it may help to get active board members more involved. But is cultural issues. So I think that many arts organizations have to tackle challenges and tensions as part of a governance approach, both with founders, management, professional staff, and volunteers. So everything from harassment and discrimination, be it Me Too, or sort of managing diversity and inclusion challenges, or achieving diversity and inclusion goals and challenges to doing that. I don't know how to frame the question, but I think that the question really is, how do you manage those issues as between the board and the management of a particular organization? How do you coach a board or inform a board or equip a board to help guide the management of an organization? And how do you manage the PR piece when you presumably don't have a PR team to help you, and all those fun things? I'll turn it to Christine. I'll turn it to you first, and then Jane.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think one of the things generators learned with our various lessons in the past couple of years, and last year in particular, is that one of the things that we can do is budget for support. And so now going forward, we have an annual line in the budget for $4,000 to pull in specialized legal or human resources or whatever kind of expertise is required, so that the board isn't sitting in a corner hand wringing when crises arise, so that there's a pool of money available to answer those questions. And should we not use that money in the year, we put it into a restricted fund called Access and Accountability, so that the pool of things grows if greater challenges than what that $4,000 can meet is required at some point in the future. We're also looking at it like an omnibudsman kind of role, so that because of what Jane and I have talked about, that there's a necessity of personal proximity between the board and the management, there's an external third party people can come to if they have questions. That is a very early drafting, like, that's not written down anywhere thing that we've been doing, but it's just, again, one of the things of like, how do we create another layer of support for folks in what is necessarily for management and volunteer coordination, a deep relationship that is maybe not the safest place to bring all kinds of conflict to.
Jane?
Yeah, it's just like everything about it is relationships. It's just constant, understanding how to build and sustain healthy relationships. And when it goes awry, as it sometimes can go awry, and you just need one person to sort of come in and they don't sort of fit the culture, or they want to take control for whatever reason. It's very difficult to have you can have policies and they help, but they don't always solve the problem. And sometimes somebody has to just speak up and get the ball rolling if it's not working, because And, I've just struggled. Sometimes it's taken like 3 years just to get one problematic board member off the board. I mean, it's ridiculous. All the energy in the organization goes to that one single solitary problem. And at all the discussions, everything is focused there. It's destructive. If there was one thing I could say is when you start to have a problem, deal with it. And I like the idea of the ombudsman. Or there has to be somebody who's willing to step up and just say, you know what, this isn't working, and thank you for your work, but we're asking you to leave now, if that's the issue, right? There's other issues too.
So as we close, I will turn and ask both of you for your final recommendations. What are the keys in your view to a successful governance model as between the professional management, the board, volunteers, or whatever your tips may be?
Well, the first thing I would say is work with Jane Marsland. A long time mentor of mine, and is one of the most radical thinkers, I think, in arts management in maybe even the world, but definitely Canada.
Radical doesn't do it with many boards.
But that's why you're so great, Jane. But secondly to that is like it is volunteer management. So like know how much time you have to put into it and build a board that can support that can work with the time you have to put into it. So many artists come to me like, how do I get my board to like do things on your own? I'm like, you don't. That's not a thing. They need to be guided and directed and managed, and in a way that is supportive of their strategy and gives them autonomy to make decisions. But a self-governing board is a dream. So what can you do to support them? What is it you're trying to achieve? And how can you right size that for what's possible for you?
Jane?
It's hard to follow that. It's like it summed up my thinking there, but you know what? It's all about people, right? And people are messy. And I think the one thing you have to do is acknowledge that it's never going to be perfect because they're not robots. I bet you even robots will be messy because they'll be like us. We think we'll be solving the problem with robots and not. But, I still think that like attention to ensuring that people really understand why the organization exists and why they're there, whether in staff or on the board, and have some good written processes and policies. I think they have to be in writing, because the one thing that's helpful when you have to make a hard decision, to have a piece of paper say, you're not following this, or this is our values, and this is the way we want to work. If it's not written, it's going to be a lot harder.
Thank you both. I think that this was eye-opening. I know from the work I do with organizations that for me, this was eye-opening as a board member, as well as wearing all the hats, a board member, an officer, a volunteer, a member. And I know it was likely invaluable to all those attending. So thank you both. In absentia, thank you to Terry. Thank you to Carol for all of her time putting this together. I believe, Christina, that you'll follow up with the slides for all attendees. So, and thank you all for attending and for the great work that you do to make Canada's arts and creative community thrive. Without a very vibrant, not-for-profit and charitable sector within the arts community, I don't think we would have an arts community like we do, and it is pretty incredible. So thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you.